The sale barn smelled like it always did in July. Manure and dust and something you couldn't name, something older than either of those things. A kind of low-grade dread that clung to the air the same way it clung to the men standing along the fence. It was the summer of 1984, and the trailers were lined up past the gravel lot, out onto the county road, engines idling in the heat. You could see the cattle from the road if you slowed down. Black Angus, mostly, some Herefords, a few mixed breeds nobody would have been proud to name 2 years earlier when prices were better. Now they were just weight on legs, and the legs were walking up the chute, and the numbers were being called, and the checks were being written. I remember those sale barns. You could tell who was selling out and who was just selling down. It wasn't something you could point to, not the number of animals, not the brand on the side. It was something in the posture. A man selling down stands at the fence watching his cattle go, and he's still calculating. A man selling out stands a little further back. He stopped calculating somewhere on the drive in. Earl Duchesne drove past that sale barn on a Tuesday morning in July, and he did not stop. He slowed down. He looked at the line of trailers, and then he kept going. The numbers that summer were not complicated, even if they felt like they were. Corn had been running high since late spring, a combination of tight carryover stocks from the previous year and weather uncertainty across the Corn Belt that made buyers nervous. By June, feed corn was pricing out in ways that rewired the math on every cow-calf operation in the county. Here is what the math looked like, plainly stated. If you are running a 100-cow herd and your feed cost rises by $40 per animal unit per year, that is $4,000 of additional annual expense that was not in last year's budget. That number doesn't feel catastrophic until you stack it against your operating loan balance, your land payment, your fuel costs, and the fact that calf prices had softened because everyone was selling at once. Feed cost decides. That was the thing most people learned in 1984, or should have learned. Not land cost, not interest rates, not even drought directly. The drought mattered because it moved grain prices. Grain prices moved feed costs. Feed costs moved the margin line. And when the margin line moved far enough, the animals had to go. Earl had been running about 90 cows on ground that his father had broken 30 years earlier. Not a large operation by any measure that mattered to lenders. They had bigger customers. But it was a continuous operation. No significant gaps. No years where the herd had to be rebuilt from scratch. That continuity had a value he understood better than he could explain to a loan officer. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings that June and July with a yellow legal pad, and he did not write down feelings. He wrote down numbers. Feed per animal unit, projected winter forage needs, current hay inventory, corn forage needs, current hay inventory, corn price forward estimates, the ratio of purchased feed to raised feed, broken down by month. The ratio is where you find the exposure. He had been purchasing somewhere around 60% of his winter feed needs. That number had felt acceptable when corn was cheap. In the summer of 1984, it was a structural problem he had been choosing not to see. Dependency hides inside profit. That's the thing about a margin that feels comfortable. It absorbs inefficiency without showing you the bill. Earl had been profitable enough in the years before that his feed dependency hadn't cost him visibly. The input was high, but the output was higher, and as long as that relationship held, there was no reason to redesign anything. Until there was. His neighbor, Leon Pratt, sold 83 head in a single week in early July. Earl heard about it before Leon told him, which is how those things work. He didn't judge it. Leon had a different cost structure, more purchased inputs, a bigger operating line, a land payment that was financed at rates that looked reasonable in 1979 and looked different in 1984. Selling made sense for Leon. It was the rational response to his specific pressure. Most people thought the cattle were the problem. They weren't. The cattle were the asset. The problem was the dependency that the cattle had been built on top of. Purchased feed, purchased inputs, margins that required grain to stay cheap, and calves to stay expensive simultaneously. When that combination broke down, the asset had to go. Not because cattle were bad, because the structure supporting them was fragile. Earl sold 22 head. He was deliberate about which 22. He kept his best cows. He culled hard on older animals and on anything that had underperformed on feed conversion. He reduced his herd, but he did not liquidate it. The difference between those two things is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of whether you intend to continue. The 22 head gave him breathing room. It reduced his winter feed requirement by roughly a quarter. It improved his loan position slightly. And it bought him time to do something he had been sketching out on that yellow legal pad for the better part of 3 weeks. The county extension office had published material on forage-based systems for years that most people read once and filed away. Earl had read it more than once. He understood the basic economics. If you could raise more of your own winter feed, hay, stockpiled fescue, small grain forages, you reduced your exposure to grain price volatility. You traded yield certainty for input certainty. You made your cost structure internal rather than external. The trade-off was real. Corn yielded more energy per acre than most forages. If you could grow corn cheaply and buy corn cheaply, a forage-heavy system made no sense. But corn was not cheap in 1984, and growing it required fuel, fertilizer, and equipment use that made the per-unit cost higher than the price at the elevator suggested. He made a decision in early August that his neighbors found baffling at the time. He shifted 30 acres, roughly a third of his tillable ground, out of row crop production and into a managed forage rotation. He planted a mixed stand of orchard grass and alfalfa on 20 of those acres and seeded the other 10 to a winter annual for early spring grazing. He kept the remaining tillable ground in corn, which he would harvest for silage rather than dry grain, which gave him more energy per acre than buying dry corn equivalent at current prices. His brother-in-law, Dale, told him at a family dinner in September that he was making a mistake, that the forage ground would underperform, that alfalfa establishment was unpredictable, that he was reducing his flexibility. Earl did not argue. He said he understood the risk. He said he was more worried about a different risk. And then he passed the bread. Scale without control is exposure. He didn't say that at dinner. He thought it. A bigger herd fed on purchased inputs was not a stronger position than a smaller herd fed on internal production. Not in a year like 1984, not in the years that followed. The scale looked like strength from the outside, and it was fragility from the inside because every bushel of purchased corn was a cord connecting your margin to a market you could not influence. The alfalfa establishment that fall was not what he hoped. The seedbed had some competition from weeds, the rain came late, and by the time the ground froze, the stand was thin in places. Earl walked that field in November, and he felt what any farmer feels looking at a thin stand going into winter. A specific, quiet uncertainty that doesn't announce itself loudly, but sits behind everything else. His wife, Marjorie, asked him one evening in late November whether he was worried. He said yes. She asked whether he thought he'd made the wrong call. He said he didn't think so. That those were two different questions. That winter was tighter than the previous year had been, because his inventory was smaller and his forage production was not yet reliable. He stretched his hay by limit feeding in the coldest stretches and by grazing corn stalks on the acres he had harvested in fall. The cattle lost some condition, not dangerously, but visibly to anyone who was looking. Leon Pratt came by in February. He had sold most of his herd the previous summer, and now he was asking around about where a man might buy bred heifers at a reasonable price going into spring. The problem was that the reasonable price didn't exist anymore. The farmers who had liquidated in the summer of 1984 had done so at the bottom of the market. The farmers who had waited, the ones who hadn't been forced to sell, were now holding animals that had appreciated simply by surviving the correction. You could tell who was buying back and who was starting over. It was the same thing as before, something in the posture. Spring of 1985 did not deliver a dramatic recovery. That is not how these things work, and anyone who tells you differently is selling something. Calf prices stabilized. Feed grain costs eased slightly as the new crop came in stronger than the previous year. The pressure that had been extreme in the summer of 1984 became moderate, and then manageable, and then routine. But manageable and routine meant different things to different operations, depending on what those operations looked like going in. Leon Pratt and the farmers like him were rebuilding. Rebuilding meant buying back into the market at prices that had firmed, which meant spending money they had recovered in the summer's liquidation, plus interest, plus time. The cycle of selling and buying back is not a neutral transaction. You sell at the bottom and buy at the recovery. The spread between those two prices is the cost of the panic. Not a moral cost, a financial one. Earl's alfalfa stand came through better than he had feared. The thin patches had winter killed, but the established portions had survived, and by May he had enough forage coming on that he reduced his purchased feed budget by roughly 35% compared to the previous winter's actual spend. Not 60%, which had been his theoretical target. 35. But 35 was real and it was his, and it wasn't subject to a price quote from anyone at a grain elevator. Survival rarely looks impressive. That's the part that is hard to explain to people who weren't there. The farms that made it through that period didn't make it through because something dramatic happened for them. They made it through because something less dramatic failed to destroy them. The structural adjustments Earl had made reduced his exposure enough that the volatility of 1984 and early 1985 passed through his operation without collapsing it. He was not insulated from the pressure. He was less fragile than he had been, which was all he had been trying to achieve. By 1986, his herd was 68 cows, down from 90 at the beginning of 1984, smaller by any measure that a county agent would use to evaluate an operation's viability. But the cost structure underneath those 68 cows was different from what had been underneath the 90. His raised forage percentage had climbed steadily. The orchard grass and alfalfa stands had thickened with management. He had added a small stockpiled fescue paddock system that let him extend grazing into early winter, which cut his hay feeding period by 3 to 4 weeks per year. That compression of the feeding window sounds modest. Over 100 cows, over a decade, it is not modest. He was still buying some corn, not as a dependency, but as a supplement during peak lactation periods in early spring. The difference between buying corn as a dependency and buying corn as a supplement is the difference between a variable you cannot control, determining your survival, and a variable you have bounded within a system you designed. Feed cost decides. But you have more influence over that decision than you think if you are willing to redesign the system that generates the cost. I think about what he didn't do more than what he did. He didn't sell everything. He didn't wait for a signal from prices before acting. He didn't redesign his system after the pressure had passed, when it was safe and obvious. He redesigned it during the pressure, when the redesign was uncertain and looked from the outside like stubbornness or confusion. He didn't vilify the farmers who sold. They had different structures, different debts, different constraints. Some of them made the exact right call given their position. Selling isn't failure. Selling your assets while the system that made them necessary to sell remains unchanged. That is the thing worth examining. The question isn't whether you sell in a downturn. The question is whether selling addresses the actual exposure or just the immediate pressure. Those are not the same thing. Selling reduces pressure by reducing scale. Redesigning the system reduces pressure by reducing dependency. The first solution has a cost at the other end of the cycle. The second solution changes the shape of the cycle you're inside. System design outlives panic. That phrase sounds simple. It is simple. What is not simple is the belief required to act on it when you are standing in a sale barn in July 1984, and the trailers are lined up to the road, and the checks are being written, and every signal in the environment is telling you to join the line. Earl Duchenne did not join the line. He went home. He got out a yellow legal pad. He wrote down numbers until the numbers told him something he hadn't already decided to believe. That's the part that doesn't make a good story. There was no moment, no speech, no turning point you could film. Just a man at a kitchen table doing arithmetic until the arithmetic pointed somewhere. The farms that failed in that era, and many did, failed for reasons that the sale barn could not solve. They failed because their input structure required prices and conditions that were outside their control to remain favorable simultaneously. When those conditions broke, the scale that had looked like strength became the mechanism of the failure. More animals meant more purchased feed, meant more exposure, meant more pressure, meant larger liquidation, meant harder rebuild. Smaller and controlled can outperform larger and dependent. Not always. Not in every market condition. But in a period of input volatility, in a period where the cost of what you are buying fluctuates faster than the price of what you are selling, the operation that has internalized more of its own production is not competing on the same terms as the operation that has not. It is playing a different game, a slower game with lower peaks and higher floors. Earl's peak production years by cattle numbers were behind him by 1986. He would not rebuild to 90 cows. He rebuilt to 72 eventually. He held there for years. His son took over the operation in the mid-1990s and held roughly the same structure. More forage acres, less purchased feed dependency, a herd size that fit the land's carrying capacity without requiring external inputs to bridge the gap. No rebuild needed. That phrase sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. The cost of rebuilding a breeding herd from cold stock or purchased replacements is not just financial. It is temporal. You lose the genetic selection you spent years developing. You lose the health history on your cows. You lose the institutional knowledge embedded in a herd that has been managed consistently on the same land. You can buy cattle. You cannot buy continuity. I've been thinking about this story for a long time, not because it is dramatic, it isn't, but because of what it asks of the person listening. It asks whether you can identify the hidden dependency in your own operation. Not the obvious costs, the structural ones, the ones that are invisible when the margin is good and catastrophic when the margin breaks. It asks whether you are solving for symptoms or for structure. Selling cattle in 1984 solved for pressure. Changing the rotation solved for exposure. One of those solutions expired when the cycle turned. The other one did not. And it asks the hardest question, which is whether you could sit at a kitchen table in July 1984, with trailers lined up to the county road and neighbors selling and your brother-in-law telling you that you're making a mistake, and do arithmetic instead of react. Most people can't. Not because they're wrong to react. The pressure was real, the loans were real, the feed costs were real. But because redesigning a system from inside the pressure it is generating requires you to believe, without proof, that the redesign will work, that the forage stands will establish, that the herd you kept will carry you through the winter, that the smaller scale you're accepting is a foundation and not a defeat. Dependency hides inside profit. until it doesn't. The land doesn't lie to you about this. It shows you your forage yields. It shows you your soil. It shows you whether you are farming inside your carrying capacity or outside it, whether you are building toward self-sufficiency or building toward a purchased input that someone else will price. The numbers don't lie either, if you write them down honestly. Feed per animal unit, raised versus purchased ratio, winter feeding days, margin per cow at different input price scenarios. These numbers tell you where your exposure is before the exposure becomes a crisis. If you let them, Earl Duchesne let them. He sat at that table and he let the numbers say what they said. And then he made a decision that took several years to prove itself and was never particularly dramatic when it did. That is what structural survival looks like. Not impressive, not heroic, just a different shape of fragility, a shape that happened to fit the storm that came. If something in this story sounds familiar to you, if you recognize the feeling of watching others react while you're trying to think, then I'd ask you one question before you go. What is the dependency you've been pricing at last year's input costs? Not a rhetorical question. Write it down if you need to. Get out a yellow legal pad. Do the arithmetic. You'll know it when you see it. The number that looks fine when everything is fine, and looks different when it isn't. That's where the work is, not in the sale barn, on the legal pad. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, production economics, structural decisions, the long math behind farming decisions, stay close. We're going to keep talking about it.